I'm going to go ahead and just sort of introduce who we have with us this evening. So we have Harold Nevill, Jennifer Reibe, I hope I pronounced that right, and then I will go ahead and introduce Kris Crookham, who is going to kick things off for us this evening. So Kris is a fourth generation Idahoan. She's worked in marketing in the Treasure Valley since 1984 and now works at Crookham Company. Crookham Company is a family-owned business that supplies the world with sweet corn, popcorn, onion seed, and has been doing so since 1911 in Caldwell, Idaho. Kris is currently involved with Treasure Our Valley, which is a group of concerned citizens, farmers and ranchers, and agriculture producers that know the importance of farm and ranch land to our local, national, and international economy, to our local food source, our climate, and our environment. And we're really excited to have this conversation this evening. So with that, I'm gonna go ahead and hand it over to you, Kris.
Hi there, I'm Swirt. We gathered here today at Crookham Company so that we could all be together for this presentation for you. Thank you so much for being here. As I am the tech person today, which is a little scary, but if you could just bear with me a little bit while I get some of these things up and ready to roll. I don't know if you're aware of it, but the Treasure Valley is known throughout the world as one of the largest seed producing areas in the world. There's a wide variety of different seeds that are produced here. It's very, very unique in that for its kind of gentle climate, its warm days and cool nights. And not only is the United States dependent upon this area for seed, but the entire world is really dependent for a variety of seeds that come out of here. And all these different seeds are shipped to every continent throughout the world, except for Antarctica. So you already probably knew you lived in a special place, but now you know you live in an exceptional place. And there's not many places that you can farm these kind of products the way that you can in the Treasure Valley. So I'm mainly here to introduce two very clever people, and that's Harold and Jennifer. But I wanted to start by saying that many people that I talk to believe that trying to preserve or to protect farmland from growth is a lost cause, and it isn't. And many places across the United States, and most of them are conservative in their political nature, have shown the way, and Jennifer's going to go over some of those for you so you can get a little bit more familiar with that. The second thing I hear quite a bit about is property rights, and I think that sometimes that is used to shut down a conversation, and rather than moving a conversation forward. And to move a conversation forward, I think we have to talk about responsibilities as they relate to property rights. So for instance, zoning is there to protect your property so that a factory or farm is not operating in your neighborhood. So it is protecting your property rights. So, and there's something new on the horizon that we will not go into today, but we hope to go into in the future as it develops. And that is carbon capture, because I think that it's going to add value to the farmer's land and add value to farm and open spaces in general to the Treasure Valley, particularly the Treasure Valley that has difficulty with inversions and air quality. So a farmer might not only be growing things from the soil, he might be paid to be storing things into the soil. So, and the last thing that I wanted to touch on is that I hear quite a bit that we have to develop to solve the housing problem. That didn't work for Silicon Valley, and it's not going to work in the Treasure Valley. What we have to do is, and particularly because growth doesn't pay for itself, but if we have creative and thoughtful planning, it can save farmland and it can address growth, but we have to have the conversation. So let's start that conversation with Harold. I'm going to bring him in. Let me get his presentation up here. And slideshow play, and got to get the,
Well, I want to bring those in.
yeah, I will. I got to get to the back to the meeting so I can share my screen. Thank you. And here's Harold.
Well, thank you, Chris, and thank you, everyone, for giving me some time tonight to discuss ag land loss. That's my topic, and then Jennifer will come in. She'll have more than I, and she'll be better than me. So just hang in. If you get bored with me, wait for her. So I'm here representing the Coalition for Agriculture's Future, and if you want to find out more about CAF, the Coalition for Agriculture's Future, you can check out our website. Here's our mission statement. We are very concerned about the agricultural heritage and traditions. I'll tell you my story and why I was starting to get involved in this. I was in the military for 21 years. I was born and raised in Idaho. I went away for 21 years. I was on a very heavy deployment cycle, so I didn't come back very often. And when I did come back, I wasn't paying attention. I was usually here for a funeral or something like that. So when I retired in 1997 and came back to live for good, I sort of woke up to the fact that things had changed a lot since I left as a 20-year-old. And so I got involved, and I spent 6.5 years on Canyon County Planning and Zoning, and I've been involved in CAF and other things through the years, because I saw during that time, that between the time I left and come back, I knew we had an issue, but I also knew, because I've been in farming since I was a little kid, that we really needed to think about the value of land and that agricultural land was worth saving. So that's why I got involved. First thing I want to make sure is I think we have a pretty good, all of us should have a pretty good sense of the amount of agricultural land that's been lost. But here's a great slide that I got from Chris, and shows the land use changes from 1939 to 2000. You can see with 1939, it was all agriculture. That big white blotch in the middle is Lake Lowell, and the white strip across the top is the Boise River. And then you get to the 1994, the middle one, where you start picking up those yellows. Those are the cities of Caldwell, which is directly north of the western end of Lake Lowell, Nampa, Meridian, and Boise. And then you see what it looks like in 2000 with residential commercial. The yellow is expanded, but there's still pretty good amount of agriculture going on. But that's not true anymore. This is another slide that I borrowed from Chris, shows more detail of the area directly north of Lake Lowell. And it's hard to read the notes, so I retyped it and I'll show you what this shows. The highlighted area, the total highlighted kind of white looking area, that was agricultural land in 1992. And then by 2018, the blue areas had been developed. If you take the acreage from 1992 or you divide the acreage from 2018, how much was developed by the acreage in the bigger area from 1992, that's a 35% reduction. And that's a pretty significant amount. You can see the picture on the slide, the pictures of the growth of Nampa and Caldwell, but all those other areas, those blue areas, notice how many of them aren't contiguous to the cities. They're just plopped down out there because they could. We used to have the ability to do CUPs, conditional use permits, in the agricultural zone in Canyon County, and residential development was an allowed conditional use in the agriculture zone. It's not anymore, but in the 1990s and early 2000s, it was used extensively, and you can see the effect. So I don't think that the issue of the fact of ag land loss is a big issue to argue about. So I just want to look at some other studies and bring some other numbers in here so you have an idea of the effect of this loss. There's a great study. If you haven't found it, I recommend it. It's old. It was 2000. This particular study done by the University of Idaho talks about the revenue versus the cost of services for residential and commercial and ag land. Now, it's a little obtuse when you read it in the way they wrote it. So here's another way to think about it. You break it down and do the math. Residential property in Canyon County received $1.43 in services for every dollar collected. So it's costing 43 cents more than they're collecting in revenues to have residential land. On the other hand, commercial and agricultural property only receive 65 cents or 62 cents for every dollar. So it costs less. They're in effect, they're paying more in taxes and other revenue to the county than they're costing the county. And I think that way to look at it is way easier. And that means that in 2000, this study came out in 2000, we knew that taxpayers were subsidizing residential development, and we have known that, and it remains a fact. I'm saying it for years, but I will tell you that I have heard, and many of us in CAF have heard officials, elected officials, just flat out say they don't believe it. And yet, the data for this particular study is pretty easily available, and it's county-generated data. So I'm not sure why they say it's not true, but I think this is those numbers and the fact that agricultural land especially costs way less than for every dollar that they put in on revenue. That's a pretty significant thing for us to remember. Here's another study. This one jumps to, actually the data was collected in 2007. The study came out in 2009. And it's another University of Idaho. And it's talking about agricultural receipts. So this is how Canyon County, the cash agricultural receipts ranked Canyon County against all the 44 counties in Idaho. And in 70 and 80, Canyon County was the leading agricultural cash county in the state, even though Canyon County is nowhere near the largest. We're quite small compared to some of the other counties. And probably one of the major reasons for being number one, Kris already alluded to in her introduction, and it was the seed crop. We really do live in a unique area in the Treasure Valley. People talk about the trifecta of absolutely perfect conditions to raise seed. We're very isolated, surrounded by desert. That dry and arid conditions of the desert, the volcanic soil, and then we have water. Not when this area was first, first had white men come into it, but with the introduction of irrigation, we've got the ability, and that climate, the soil, and the water made Canyon County a phenomenal producer of seed crop. But you see it starting to drop off. By 2008, we were clear down to the fourth most, and there are some contributing factors to that. The dairy industry moving into the Twin Falls area and stuff kind of had those counties start increasing their revenue. But you could ask yourself, what's another reason for Canyon County to be going down in the rankings? And one of those reasons is the loss of operational farm. And these numbers are out of the study that I'm quoting here. We went from, in 1997, total farm acres of 367,000. 10 years later, it had dropped 100,000 acres of operational farm acres. So almost 30% reduction in operational farmland. That's a pretty significant amount. Another way to think of this is if this study brings out the amount of money that each acre of agricultural land produces, and you can see that over 15,000 in base sales per acre, 3,300 in base wages, and it accounts for 0.1 jobs. Well, that's a pretty substantial amount per acre. If you go back and say, well, wait a minute, we lost 100,000 at almost $16,000 in base sales, that's $1.6 billion. So that's a pretty significant loss in that 10 years. Another reason to be concerned, if you're not already. I'm going to fast forward to data that was collected in 2016 by Dr. Jody Brandt. I would bet that many of you have seen this slide because I borrowed it from Dr. Brandt because you've probably attended her ag summits or seen her presentations in the past. But at her 2020 ag summit, she shared some data. It's a background data. 60% of Idaho's land is public, but 40% is private, and 22% is in farmland. And about 25,000 farms, that sets the base. But then you add in the fact that Idaho's the fastest growing state in the nation population-wise. And she created this map projecting forward to 2100 and how much land would be lost. Now I'm going to show you that portion of the slide again because it's pretty small. But I will tell you that I do travel around quite a bit around the country with my job. Well, I'm an educator, by the way. So I make my money in education and then I throw it away on my farm. But as I travel around, it is amazing for me to hear in airports and in conferences how many people are discussing Idaho as a destination. And if they continue to come, and if we continue to allow them to come and build wherever they want, then perhaps Dr. Brandt's projection will come true. Here's that same piece of that slide that I showed you. It's just blown up a little bit so you can see it. And I want to compare it. This is the same slide I showed you earlier with that the area that's north of Lake Lowell, and you can compare. You can see that area from the slide with the land loss, and Dr. Brandt is talking about loss by the year 2100. It's already 2100 in some areas of the Treasure Valley. That area north of Lake Lowell is already heavily developed. So it won't be, we don't have to wait around to 2100 to see what it's going to look like. In fact, her projection from that Ag Summit was that we could, if we don't do something differently, by the year 2100, if we keep the same high level of population growth, we could lose 65% of our ag land in the Treasure Valley. So her take-home message, pretty important. And this is a slide produced by her, and I stole it, and I appreciate very much her allowing me to use it. But the land use decisions that we make now are going to really make a difference in how many acres we lose. And I will say that Chris mentioned the argument about property rights. I would say, remember that property rights are not God-given rights. They're not life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Property rights are derived from society, and they're products of society. And we can change the rules, and we can make better decisions so that we don't fulfill Dr. Brandt's projection. And if you want, I want to give full credit to her and her team. If you want to get more information, there's the information on how you get more information from her studies. Later, I mentioned that Jennifer's going to talk after me, and she's going to talk about land use decisions that might lessen the loss of ag land. I'm going to finish talking about prevailing attitudes towards ag land preservation, and I think that's key to how the decisions that we can make. I think the attitudes of Idahoans may be changing, or so many people have moved to Idaho from more progressive areas that our demographics are changing, one or the other. But this is a study that is just now coming out. It was conducted by the Canyon County Development Services Department. I want to note that this data is still kind of in its infancy, and it hasn't been finalized yet. So we should consider these preliminary. But this is a pretty good study on the attitudes towards ag land loss. They ran it for February, March, and they had 845 responses with 187 self-identified as farmers. So DSD is saying that with that 825 responses, they have a 95% confidence level in the opinions that they gathered. I'm only going to share a few. I selected areas of the study that's relevant to my statement and my concerns regarding making better land use decisions. But here's one question that they asked on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being total agreement. How much do you agree with this? And this statement, this answer that I'm showing you is from that 187 farmers that self-identified as farmers. So if the statement is farmland is an important part of the tax base as it generates more tax revenue than it uses, and that is based on that I'm sure they created that question because of that 2000 study that I showed you that actually established that fact that it does generate more tax revenue than it uses in public services. It's interesting that they had a scattering of a bunch of ones, a bunch of twos, a bunch of threes, but 48.11% or 89 out of the 185 scored that statement as a 10. Total agreement, and these are farmers, self-identified as farmers. Here's another one, same scale, 1 to 10, 10 being total agreement. Farmland is important to Canyon County economic base, exports, jobs, supply chain, agricultural processing, etc. This, we just talked about the other study that talked about the base sale value per acre, somewhere around $16,000. This question hones in on that. And again, these are the farmers, self-identified as farmers, some 1s, 2s, 3s, 4s, 5s, but 48.65% or 90 of the 185 scored it in total agreement. Another question, farmland maintains and preserves a traditional way of life, leaves a legacy, improves understanding of the past. I happen to think that bumper sticker that I see out there, the no farms, no food, I think it's brilliant. But that kind of gets to that. This question kind of gets to that. And you see now 56.45 or 105 of the 186 scored it as a 10. This next one on a scale of 1 to 10, it is important to have the ability to grow our own food supply locally, regionally, and global markets. That's a realization that the ability to feed ourselves is of national strategic importance. And again, now we're up to 68.65% or 127 of the 185 scoring it as a 10. Let me jump back just a second and I'll show you another slide that came out of Dr. Brandt's presentation at the Ag Summit. She went around, her staff went around and asked in a face-to-face survey, 392 people, and asked them what ecosystem are most important. Notice food production is at the top. So whether they're talking to farmers or other people, it's showing up on hers also. So that's a good correlation between the Development Services Department's study and Dr. Brandt's. And I think the strength of that is it shows that they're on to something. And I've got one other thing from the Development Services Department's survey, and this one asked those 187 self-identified farmers, what challenges make it most difficult for you to continue farming? There's a whole bunch here. It's a pretty busy slide, but look at the third one down. 125 of those self-identified farmers out of the 187 said that farmland fragmentation is making it harder for them to farm. I think that is an attitude change and a realization that if you want to stay in farming, you're going to have a hard time if we allow the current development speed and methods to continue. They did that same survey, the Development Services Department survey, allowed some comments, and some of the comments actually give me some hope. These are comments by farmers. As a seventh generation Idahoans and third generation commercial farmers, we're proud to live, farm, and serve in the community of Canyon County, and we don't want to see that change. That's a pretty hopeful statement from farmers. Please stop allowing large subdivision apartments to be built on good farmland. A good request. We have some of the most fertile farmland in the nation. We've talked about that and the seed production that's going down. It's saddening to see destroyed by development. Once it's been built on or changed, will never return to its current usable and productive state. Those are good, positive statements and give me some hope that we might be able to change it as Kris has indicated. On the other hand, there are some that still have a different attitude, a different belief. This is a statement from a farmer. Farmers and landowners should have the right to use their land as they desire for farming or development and not be limited by the government. Canyon County should not interfere with what private landowners want to do with their own farmland. How do I request rezoning of all my farmland? That's a different view of the use of the land from what I have. Thank you very much for your time. I think that we're going to allow questions, right? So I'm going to let Kris, if you need to, do you need to do anything else or just?
Well, do you want?
I'll jump in. Yeah. So we had some really good discussion. Thank you, Harold. That was great information that you were sharing. One of the questions came in from Adam. Adam, do you want to unmute and introduce your question, or would you like me to read it for you? Do you have a preference?
I can introduce it.
Go for it.
I just wanted to make sure it didn't go to another speaker before
Absolutely.
asking this. And I thank you for this talk. That's really good stuff, and I appreciate the effort that you put into delivering this. And so like that $1.43 received for every $1 invested on residential development, that's all based off of the category services. And so I wonder, like, what is included in that category of services? And I also wonder, like, what other factors would impact that number as well that wouldn't be included in services? And those might be something like pollution or road maintenance. And so what would that number be? Would it be $2 if all those concomitant costs were included in that number, or would it be even higher than that?
If you get your hands on the study, you'll see that the cost, that $1.43 that we're spending in residential development compared to the $1 we get in taxes, that $1.43 takes into account the things that they were able to get their arms around: police, fire, roads, utilities, that type of thing. So you're right. There's probably additional costs that they couldn't get their arms around because at that time they didn't have any way to do that. But if you look at long-term effects, so pollution, reduction of the water table, things like that, they didn't take that into account. And so I think you're right. I think that it would be, if you could quantify it and put a number to it, it would probably be more than $1.43. Good question. Other questions, sir?
I don't see any more in the chat. I'm going to just give everyone a second if you want to use the raise hand option, or go ahead and type it in the chat. And if not, then we can go ahead and move on to our next panelist. But I'll just give you all one more second. They look quite quiet, so I think they're absorbing the information.
We can come back.
Absolutely. Yep.
All right, so I'm going to get out of here and let Kris come back in.
I'm going to get, I'm just going to get Jennifer's presentation up here. Do that every time. Do you want to screen share for us, Sarah? Okay, I can screen. Do you want to screen share for us, Sarah? Or?
I don't have your presentation.
Okay, hold on. Let me get up.
Okay.
Yeah. There we go. And there we go.
Thank you. So my name is Jennifer Reibe, and my background is in agriculture. I've spent my career in agriculture, and I've also been on the Planning and Zoning Commission from Payette County for about 15 years. So this issue is really at the intersection of those two worlds, and it's a topic that I've been interested in and concerned about for a long time. And on planning and zoning, when we come up with topics and issues that are difficult and we don't really know that much about because we're not planners, such as nuclear power or natural gas drilling, that kind of thing, I always find myself asking, gosh, I wonder how they deal with this in other places, because surely we're not the only ones that have had to deal with an issue like this. And so this is another one of those. And I've called and I started making phone calls and gone, this has taken me on quite a journey. And I've actually gone and visited with the planning and zoning departments in several different places to try to find out how they go about protecting their agricultural land. And so that's what I want to talk about today. So if you're not familiar with Payette County, this is kind of focused on the Treasure Valley, but we know the Boise-Caldwell area. But if you're not too familiar with Payette County, we are the next county out after Canyon County. We're on the border of Ontario. We have 3 little cities. And even though we are a little bit further out, we're under the same kinds of growth pressure as Ada and Canyon counties because of that transportation corridor. So we are an agricultural county, and we have the preservation of ag ground kind of baked into our comprehensive plan and our zoning ordinances, but nevertheless, we still find ourselves in a situation where there is potentially a lot of sprawl as people move to the area and applications come before us for growth out in the farmland. So we're always looking for ways to handle this particular problem. So what I want to talk about today is how to prevent this kind of growth, which is just kind of a mishmash of growth and agricultural land. And so in this talk, I'm going to start out and just talk about what ag protection or preservation really means and how some of the nuts and bolts of how we go about doing that. Because I've looked at some other jurisdictions, I'm going to talk about some similarities between the various programs, some things that they all seem to have in common, and then I'll dig into 3 particular case studies that I've learned about in my travels. And one is Montgomery County, Maryland, Chester County, Pennsylvania, and Dane County, Wisconsin. And I happen to have lived in 2 of these, so it gave me a little bit different insight into the land changes that have happened over time. So I want to make a distinction between true agricultural preservation and protection. And ag preservation is kind of what we consider the holy grail of land preservation. It's permanent and voluntary on the part of the landowner. And this really falls in the category of conservation or agricultural easements. And these are permanent because they actually are an easement that's attached to the deed. So the landowner can maintain ownership and do whatever they want with that land, except develop it or change that land use. And that is in perpetuity. And those 2 words tend to scare a lot of people. When they hear something is in perpetuity, there is hesitation to engage in such a long-term commitment. But there are other types of protections that we can do. I suppose this falls more in the category of protection, even though I tend to use those two words kind of interchangeably. These are not permanent and they're subject to political changes. And that is because most of the land use decisions, or all of the land use decisions at the county level, are done by county commissioners. County commissioners are elected. They can also be unelected. Similarly, on the Planning and Zoning Commission, we are appointed and we can be unappointed. So depending on the makeup of the body of decision makers, that can have a big effect on the types of decisions and the outcome of the decisions that get made. But nevertheless, planning and zoning is a key part of this whole concept of ag protection, and it can really determine the fate of the county depending on the quality and the input in the long-term planning process and how those zoning ordinances are carried out. Another key element that we use in this potentially in ag protection is the transfer or purchase of development right system. And this is a mechanism that allows a building right to be uncoupled or severed from one piece of property and either move to another piece of property or retire it altogether. And I'll talk about this quite a bit more as I move along. Tax incentive, Harold talked about this, Kris mentioned it. We know that growth, residential growth, doesn't pay for itself. So can we find or create tax incentives that make it, that better reflect the actual cost of agricultural ground and maybe make it more attractive for people to maintain agriculture as their land use for their land. And finally, there are right to farm laws. These generally can provide a little bit of protection from nuisance claims and that sort of thing, but generally they don't hold a lot of water, they don't have a lot of teeth, so I won't talk about that much today. But really, one of the really important aspects of this protection is that it's really a great opportunity for public involvement. At Planning and Zoning, we really appreciate having people come in and testify at public hearings, tell us what they know about the properties and about the area. And it's really, really important for people to get involved in the planning process, because that's where the future of the county is really determined. So any opportunity that people have, we encourage people to come in and get involved in the decision-making at Planning and Zoning. So I want to look at some characteristics of the programs that I looked at, some of the things they all seem to have in common. One is that you have to have a sizable and a vibrant farm economy that's worth preserving. And I think, Patricia Nilsson, if you're on this call, you said it best. The very best way to preserve agriculture is for agriculture to be profitable. And I think when farmers are making money off of their land, they generally don't want to sell their ground for other uses. But we also know that the encroachment of urban growth into the farmland makes it harder to farm, just much more difficult, and it starts to harm the whole farm economy. And it's not just the farmers and their land that have to be preserved, it's the whole economy. It's the equipment dealerships and the people that apply chemicals and sell seed and all those other businesses that are also part of this ag world that starts with preservation of the land. Ag zoning, you have to have large areas in order for farming to take place. And ag zoning, the number that seemed to bubble up to the top that I saw was a minimum of 25 acre lots. And just to give you an idea, I know there's not much in this picture for scale, but one of those big circles is probably 120 acres, and that little piece in blue is 25 acres. So if there was one house on every 25 acres, it would still be a bunch of houses, but it still would be open enough that farming could take place. Now, most places do have ag zoning, and just to give you a few examples, these are some minimums. In Oregon, they have a statewide, I believe it's 45 acres. I couldn't put my finger on it when I was putting this together, but I think it's a minimum 45 acre parcel. And Oregon, at a state level, has been very aggressive in preserving and protecting farmland, and it's actually very difficult to carve up properties into smaller parcels. Wisconsin, that I'll be talking about, also has a 35-acre minimum statewide. In Idaho, we don't have any sort of a statewide minimum, but if you look at some of the counties, you find that in Ada County, which we think of as not having much agricultural land left, they actually do have a 40-acre minimum in what they still call their ag ground, and some of that's the dry ground up in the foothills, but they do have some 40-acre zoning. Canyon County was also 40-acre zoning in the ag ground. And Gem County also. And now Gem County has two categories. One they call prime ag, which is irrigated ag ground, and rural ag, which is 5 acres. Now you can imagine that may be rural, but if you have an area that's carved up into 5-acre lots, it may be somewhat rural, but it's probably not agriculture, because in this country, you can't do a lot of farming on 5-acre parcels. So that I would consider a transitionary area between urban and rural. So this is that same picture expanded out a little bit. And what happens, I mean, it's great to think of zoning as being maybe the answer, and it is really important. But what happens in zoning and in planning and zoning is that people maybe have a parcel that's not very good ground, or maybe it doesn't have any irrigation water, and they might come before planning and zoning and say, hey, I'd like to put a couple houses here. And you might say, well, you know, that's okay. This area can support a couple of houses, and so that's fine, and that might be approved. But then somewhere down the road, maybe the neighbor comes in and says, well, there are some houses there. How about if I put some houses here? And some more houses go in, and you can see what happens. Pretty soon you get more, and this becomes a growth area out in the farm country. And what's more, there aren't any services out there. There's no sewer or water or anything, and people have to drive a long way to get to schools. And it becomes not an agricultural area anymore, but it becomes little pockets of growth out in the farmland. And so this is the danger, and this is one of the things that we have to guard against, because in planning and zoning and at the county level, we have to live by the former decisions, and every decision that we make is precedent setting. So we might not think about it at the time, but allowing a small pocket of growth can begin the transformation of an area. So this large acre zoning is one way to try to prevent that from happening. It's also really important to have an area where you can put that growth. So this is Canyon County, and we might think that maybe we want to try to preserve an ag belt in this county, but we can't just say, no, we're not going to allow any growth. You have to have a place to put the growth. And so you might choose this area. This happens to be the Caldwell area, but you have to be able to push the growth or allow the growth to happen in designated areas if you want to preserve the land in other areas. And a good way to think about this, or a good way to do it, is to create urban growth boundaries. And these can be single boundaries or multiple boundaries around a growth area. But there's some real advantages to having an actual line that people know about. For one thing, you can allow more compact development inside without worrying about it kind of seeping out into the rural area. And one way that can be contained is by limiting some of the services, such as sewer and water, outside of that growth boundary. And having boundaries really helps. It helps developers know what areas they can target for more intense growth. It helps landowners outside the urban boundary know that, and have some security that the land where they live is going to stay in one particular land use and not have this encroachment all the time. And so as a rule of thumb, these urban growth boundaries should contain enough space for a 20-year build out before pushing out further into the rural areas. Easements, TDR is a transfer of development right, and purchase of development rights. All of the programs that I looked at had this in some form. And so easements, you might have a grower that is committed, have some ground that's been in the farm, in the family for generations, and they want to make sure that land is going to stay as farmland forever. So they may enter into an easement, a conservation easement. And there are some of those in the Treasure Valley. There's a Treasure Valley Land Trust that creates this sort of easement. So here's an example of somebody that might put their farm into a permanent easement. But we can also do these transfers of development rights. So this is a parcel of property that may perhaps has a building right. We can, through this TDR process, we can decouple the building right from the property and move it to a parcel that maybe is in a more appropriate area for growth, but doesn't have a building permit. And the beauty of this system is that then you can, through that transaction, you can provide some compensation to the landowner for the value of that building right. And typically what I've seen is that the financial compensation doesn't end up being as much as it might be if they sold that land truly for development, but it does provide some compensation for the value of the building aspect that they're giving up. So I think this mechanism has a lot of potential. And in Payette County, I'll mention that we actually do have a TDR ordinance in our county. We're one of 2 counties in the entire state that uses TDR, and we have a lot of problems with it, and we swear at it, and we talk about eliminating it, but I do think that there's a lot of potential here, and I'm reading a book right now all about TDRs and trying to learn how we could improve this system to really make it work for us, and I think the potential is there. So to go into a little bit more detail on some of the different approaches to this problem, I looked at 3 different states. One is Montgomery County, Maryland. This is kind of a planning and zoning model. Chester County, Pennsylvania is a citizen financed model. And Dane County, Wisconsin is done at both the state and township level, not so much at the county. So I'll go through these one by one. So Montgomery County, Maryland is right smack in the middle between Washington and Baltimore. And this is a tremendously urban area. And I know this area because I happen to grow up here. And I frankly could not believe it when I was told that this was an example of ag preservation, because during my childhood, I watched it be transformed from rural agricultural into urban. And so I know how many people there are out there. But nevertheless, this is held up as kind of a flagship example of ag preservation. And when I called around to other jurisdictions, they would all say, well, you looked into Montgomery County, Maryland. And so I did look into it, and I went and sat down with their planning and zoning department and learned about it. And sure enough, it really is a well-developed and well-thought-out program, and it preserved about 1/3 of the county. So what they said was that between 1950 and 1970, they were going through rapid growth and urbanization, and that was the period of the baby boom after World War II. And they went from a population of about 150,000 up to 500,000 in that 20-year period. And they were very concerned about losing their agricultural base and changing the whole character of the county and losing it to urban growth. And so in 1980, they took the step of creating this, what they call the agricultural reserve. So it was created in 1980, and they did this completely through this TDR sending and receiving concept. So in the sending area, which is the ag reserve, they started out by what they call down zoning. Now this is when you go from having, say, a minimum of 1 house per 5 acre. You say, okay, now you can only build 1 house per 25 acres. And you can imagine how that went over. And they said that there was some pushback from the landowners in that ag reserve, but there was so much public support for it and so much momentum that they were able to go forward with this program. So they took that step first, because in the county at that time, at 1980, that was the general zoning of the county, was 1 house per 5 acres. So within that ag reserve, those landowners could only build 1 house per 25 acres. But they told them the remaining building rights that would ordinarily go with 1 per 5 acres were eligible for transfer or TDR out of the ag reserve. And at the same time, they also limited the extension of sewer and water out into that ag reserve. And in Maryland, sewer and water was required for subdivision approval. So that was another way that they could limit the growth into the ag reserve. Now, in that receiving area, they created urban growth boundaries, and this was done largely through that sewer and water prohibition to go beyond the urban growth boundary. But what was critically important, what really made this work, is that they created incentives for developers to purchase those TDRs. And they did this primarily through density. So if a developer, for example, through zoning, was allowed to put in 1 house per 2 acres in these other areas of the county, if they purchased a block of these TDRs out of the ag reserve, then they could increase their density to, for example, 1 house per acre. And that is a huge incentive for developers, because the incremental increase in what they can make in that development goes up astronomically. So Montgomery County was able to find that sweet spot, the correct incentive for developers to purchase the TDRs, and that also created enough value for the landowners in the reserve to sell those TDRs, and it worked. And so 40 years later, they have 93,000 acres in the ag reserve. It's a very stable agricultural part of the state. There are wineries, truck crops, there's agritourism, livestock, and open space. And I think, I actually have a friend that farms in Maryland, still miraculously outside of the ag reserve, and I just found out was actually involved in creating this. And he said it was the best thing that Montgomery County ever did, and that it's just really appreciated to this day. So this is in fact a success story of planning and zoning and ag protection. And I am not going to show this little video, but this is quite a nice little YouTube. It's about 5 minutes long that will tell you a little bit more about it if you go to the Montgomery County Agricultural Reserve and see what they say. They go into a little bit of detail and tell you how the process started. So I encourage you to watch that if you have a few minutes. So the next one I'll talk about is Chester County, Pennsylvania. And similar to Montgomery County, this is an area outside of a large urban center. And in this case, the landowners themselves were very concerned about losing their way of life and the character of the area and the encroachment from Philadelphia. So in this particular case, this was taken to the voting box. This was put on as a ballot measure in 1989 for a $50 million bond, which passed with 82% in favor, and which is just mind-boggling today to think of anything passing with 82% in favor. But this was very popular and very well supported at the time. And so they were able to raise the money to begin this program of purchasing development rights. And this was really designed as an open space bond. And I think this was the first open space bond ever proposed. But because there's so much of that open space is agricultural, it also had the effect of preserving ag as a land use. Since that time, there have been 3 to 4 more additional bonds that have passed. They've spent a total of $215 million from money generated through the bonds and leveraged another $424 million. So really a well-funded program. And these were municipal, state, and federal funds. And that's another thing that I find in common with these funded programs is that if you can get some local money, a lot of times you can get matching money from the state or federal government to contribute to these kinds of purchasing programs. So this was done through purchasing development rights, and they said that there's quite a lengthy process to determine the market value of these development rights currently, but they range from anywhere from $2,000 to $10,000 per acre. So these are not sold per development right, but the rights are sold on a per acre basis. So this is an ongoing program. They have a county office that administers this program. It's got a budget of over $7 million a year. So still a pretty big effort and well accepted in that area. And similar to Montgomery County, in 2020, they've preserved almost 30% of their county, 149,000 acres.
Is this a conservative area?
And this is a very conservative area. So I was told, and Tricia Nilsson, who works at Canyon County, came from Chester County. She worked there, and she said that she moved to Idaho to try to find some place that was a little bit more liberal because it's a very conservative area. So this is not a partisan issue. This is just a landowner issue. And they also have a nice little video on this, return on environment. This is kind of an interesting one because they put some dollars to the value of this land preservation in terms of health and reducing visits to the doctor's office by people being outside, and the value of clean water and the increase in land values because it's such a beautiful and popular place to live. And they try to put some numbers to that. And it's nice, and it's clear in these videos that these communities are very proud of what they've done. So it's quite an accomplishment. So my third example is Dane County, Wisconsin. This is both a state and township model. So Dane County is in south central Wisconsin. As it happens, I lived here too, so I had a little bit of familiarity with this area. So the counties in Wisconsin have a little bit different political designations than we do. So Dane County is where the capital of Wisconsin is, Madison, which is a city of, well, that's over 250,000 now, and not unlike Boise. It was a city of about the same size. Boise's grown quite a bit now, but still pretty agricultural out in the county. They have 72% of the land in Dane County is agricultural, and there's a lot of diverse crops there that they're dealing with. As I said, they have a different political designation. So in the county is broken up into townships, and each township has its own planning and zoning and its own governmental system. So this is a map of Dane County, and you can see that all of the gray was Madison in between those two lakes, but now it's kind of sprawled out and consumed quite a bit of land in these other smaller areas. And the townships that I'm going to talk about are Dunn and Cross Plains. And Dunn in particular was really concerned about being encroached on and having their character and their land gobbled up by the growth coming out of that little city of Fitchburg. So they took some pretty serious steps to prevent that from happening. And that's actually how I found out about this, because I have a friend that lives in Dunn, and they said that their neighbor had come and asked them if they would be interested in selling the development rights to their property. And so I got interested in that and followed up on it, and had a chance to go to Wisconsin not long afterwards, and went and sat down and visited with the Dane County Planning and Zoning. So this was done, and it's done through the purchase of development rights using multiple funding sources. So some of that comes from Dunn Township itself, some comes from the county, some comes from the state, and some even from the USDA. And this is a map of the township, and the blue, if you just look at all that blue area, those are conservation easements owned and administered by the town of Dunn itself. So it's a pretty good chunk of the county. But the light green is Dane County, and there's the dark green is the Department of Natural Resources. And I'm not sure if these are actually easements or if the departments actually own this ground, but there's some Nature Conservancy and other holdings as well. But I was impressed that for a relatively small area that they had taken these forward-looking and aggressive steps to preserve as much of the farm ground as they could. Cross Plains is a little bit different, and I don't want to go too much in depth there, except to point out that the green and the red represent sending and receiving areas for these TDRs. So they have mapped out their entire township, figured out where they want to put those building rights if they can detach them from the sending parcels. So another good example of the TDR at work. But what they told me when I visited with the county planning and zoning, they said, yes, you know, we have this program in Dunn and they're Cross Plains, you should look at that. But they said, you know, really, if you're interested in ag preservation, you know, you should really look at what Wisconsin has done. And they said it really comes down to what they called the grand bargain back in 1979. And in fact, in the 70s was a time when there was a lot of interest in ag preservation. And that's when most of these states took the step of creating these parcel minimums. And in fact, in Idaho, the Local Land Use Planning Act was passed, I believe, in 1974. And that's what allowed us to create planning and zoning in the first place. So a lot of activity in the 70s. So in 1979, the grand bargain was that they created this statewide 35-acre minimum parcel. And he said, above everything else that the townships are doing or anything else, this alone, this 35-acre minimum parcel has had a greater effect on minimizing sprawl and preserving their ag ground than anything else. And he said, people come in here and they say, well, you know, I just have this little parcel down by the river. I can't use it for anything else. Can't I just put a house there? And they just say, no, because if we did that for you, we'd have to do it for everybody. And this is what the state says. It's a 35-acre minimum parcel. So that has really gone a long way. In addition to that, though, Wisconsin has this farmland preservation program, which involves income tax credits. These are not property tax credits, but income tax credits of $5 to $10 an acre, which, you know, if you're a big landowner, they said, you know, for people that really own a lot of land, this amounts to a big enough chunk of money that it gets their attention and it makes them think about keeping their ground in farmland. In order to participate in this program, there are some other requirements. There's some conservation requirements and for riparian areas and minimizing runoff and that kind of thing. And it does require that the landowners sign a 15-year contract. So that gives the planning departments and the state and the local jurisdictions a much better horizon to know what's coming in terms of growth. So that's three very different ways of dealing with this. What does this mean for Idaho and in our area for the Treasure Valley? Lots of ideas and no easy answers. That's what I would say. But I think there are some things that we could learn and hopefully put into place here. The first thing I would say is that we have to be out in front of this issue. And I see it in Payette County. I see it coming, and I'm just desperate to come up with ways to get in front of this before land speculators and builders are knocking on the door, which it's happening there too. But once that's happened, it's very hard to take this kind of step. I think it's much easier when the farming is active and that's already the existing land use in the area. So I think it's really important to get out ahead of this. Number two, I think these lot size minimums are really important. And I think here in the Desert West, there's a tremendous temptation to build houses on every piece of ground that's not actually farmable. So we have dry corners and pivots, and there may be parcels that don't have irrigation and ridges and anything that's not quite usable for farmland. But once you allow growth to creep in like that, I think it's the beginning of the transformation. So I think we need to think about ag by zone, not by individual parcel. And that's not always the way that landowners think about it. So similarly, I think large areas, we need to think about the agriculture and the open space in these areas, not just the irrigable prime farm ground. I think the transfer of development program has a lot of potential, and I'm learning more about it. We've been administering these TDRs. I've been involved in this for 15 years, but there's a lot yet to learn about them and what might make a TDR program work and what might prevent it from working. But I think there's a lot of potential there. In order to do that, you really need designated sending and receiving areas. And I heard this loud and clear from the group in Montgomery County. You have to have a place to put the growth and it has to be clear cut. And so that you can create this exchange of building permits. And I think urban growth boundaries is a good way to do that. And that, as I said, it's clear to everybody where the growth is going to be and where it's going to come from. In Payette County, we have 3 small cities, and we have a designated city impact area, which I know in other places in Canyon County they do too. We are looking seriously in our next round of planning to make better use of these impact areas and maybe create the impact area as a sort of urban growth boundary. And so that's something I think that needs a further look as well. In order to make these transfers of development rights really work, I think we've got to create the right incentives for those TDRs to be used in the growth areas. We've got to incentivize that transfer so that it's attractive enough for the landowners to sell those building rights and that builders have some incentive to purchase them. And that's really will take some insight. One way to do that, I think, is going to be by using them to allow higher density if coupled with TDR, and figuring out what that level and what that density is tricky, but I think that's what we need to address in our planning process. And finally, maybe a ballot measure. I think that there was an open space bond in Boise some years ago. I personally, Harold mentioned this, I think that there is an appetite for steps to preserve agriculture right now. We did a survey in Payette County just to get an idea of what people thought about agriculture. Do we still want to preserve ag in our comp plan? And it came back, this was last year, it came back overwhelmingly in favor of preserving ag. And we got a lot of the comments similar to what Harold talked about. Don't build subdivisions out in the rural areas. Quit converting farmland into subdivisions. People, I think, really are concerned about this issue and are willing to take steps to do that. So I see that as a positive, and I'm hopeful that we can do that as well. So that is all I have to present, and I would be happy to answer questions if there are any.
Great, thank you. So we've had quite a few. I'm going to go ahead and call on Greg. He entered a couple. If you want to share your question using your own microphone, you can go ahead and unmute yourself now.
Okay, I just have one question about how the values for the transfer and development rights, the development rights were determined.
So it's different in every jurisdiction. I think in Chester County, they have quite a formula that they use. It's not the 100%, it never seems to be 100% of the marketable value of that land as development property, but it is some percentage of that. In Payette County, I would say that our TDR process, I think a transfer or a building right generally costs $10,000 to $15,000. So that is one that a landowner would purchase from another landowner in order to apply to a piece of property that didn't have a building right. So it just depends on the jurisdiction and how it's valued.
I saw another interesting comment that I'm hoping to call upon. Cheryl, if you're able to unmute yourself, I'd love to hear you explain LISA. Jennifer, are you familiar with LISA? The Land Evaluation Site Assessment?
No.
Okay. Cheryl, are you able to unmute and share that with the group?
So I have a really tough connection. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, okay. So it's actually an old system. It's with the original farmland protection program with soils, the soil map. But what we found is that it was something that got even smaller communities excited, because what we would, at that time, talking about land use, any kind of rules or regulations got people upset. And so if we talked about protecting farmland, that tended to get people excited versus upset about land use regulations. And so what you do is it's just a step-by-step process. I have the a little short paper on it somewhere I can send everybody. But it's just getting together in the group, the locality, whether it's state or local community, to work through that system of saying, here's our area we'd like to grow in that you all are talking about, and here's our area we'd like, based on soils, for grasslands and farmland, rangeland, agriculture in general, and that we want to try and protect. And somebody mentioned the wildlife, which is great. You know, it's connecting all those things together is when we can really have really good wildlife land. So anyways, it just helps formalize that in a mapping process. And now that we have GIS, it's a lot easier than it used to be, where we'd have to draw them out. So full disclosure, I'm retired NRCS USDA.
Well, I'll check into that.
So I don't see any other specific questions in the chat. So if you have a question that you'd like to add, feel free to add it in the chat or raise your hand. If we have a second while we wait for people to, oh, there, I see a hand. Okay, I'll pause that thought for a second. Elaine, go ahead.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate this presentation tonight. It's great to see this subject being raised again. There's been a number of efforts over a period of years to try to build the political will to do something about it. I do think that you guys are right that there might be political will at this time, and I loved your conclusions about where we might go, and think that you know, a regional effort might actually get us somewhere. But within that regional effort, I think there could be county by county things, such as serial levies. The Boise Foothills Open Space Levy was not a bond. It only required a 50% vote because it's what's called a serial levy. You only collect the money over 2 years, but then you have, you know, any number of years to spend it. And it really makes it easier sell, especially the first time. The second time we would have been able to get a bond. We got a high enough vote count, but I think that TDRs and acre minimum would be a great place to start, and would love to also talk about how to use area of city impact as a de facto urban growth boundary.
I agree.
We had another question come in. David, do you want to unmute and introduce your question?
Sure. Can you hear me?
Yes.
So is the difference between a TDR and a PDR merely that the PDR is a purchase of the development rights? And if that's the case, what would be the incentive with just a transfer if the landowner is not receiving any kind of compensation?
So the landowner would receive compensation in either one. So that with the transfer, the landowner receives compensation, and that building right gets moved somewhere else to an area that may be more appropriate for growth. The PDR, the purchase of development right, is the same financial transaction, but that building right is retired. And so it just goes nowhere. It just is a dead end. It gets removed from that property, but it doesn't get transferred to another property. That's the primary difference. But both of them involve a financial transaction.
Okay. And if I may, just because I happen to be unmuted, what has been the general response from county commissioners in general, be they Payette or Canyon County, to this movement, or to the principles of ag preservation?
Well, I can only speak for Payette County and my county commissioners, and ag preservation is something we've talked about ever since I started on planning and zoning. But this sort of more involved approach, we're talking about it. I think that they recognize that maybe it's time to take some steps. You know, we did, as I said, we did this survey a year ago in gearing up for our upcoming comprehensive plan, and we kept coming up on this question. You know, we can't plan. We don't know what to do about growth unless we know what people want to do about agriculture, because it's always been fundamental to our comprehensive plan, but maybe people don't really care about that anymore. Maybe we're to the point where they want to take advantage of some of the growth that's coming this way. And so we developed this survey. And as I said, overwhelmingly, people want us to preserve ag in our planning and zoning efforts. And so with that sort of public support, if we can maintain that and keep them involved in the planning process, we may get somewhere. And I've given this presentation to my county commissioners. They're interested. We're interested in solutions. Getting there is going to take a lot of effort, but we're looking at it.
So the call out that I wanted to do, and feel free again as I keep talking if you have questions to either use the chat box or raise your hand, but I was hoping to call on Tricia Nelson. You mentioned her a couple times in your presentation, and she is on our call tonight, and she's been very active in our chat bar, which is great. She mentioned that she had 2 land use decisions that the Canyon County Commissioners made yesterday that she was hoping to share. So Tricia, if you are there and want to unmute and share, go for it.
And I'm so happy that Kris and Harold can hear this story too. It was quite the day yesterday at Canyon County, and you couldn't have a better contrast of land use decisions before a county commission. So in the morning we had it was 184 residential lots, which is really unusual for county. It was a subdivision in Nampa's impact area. It was consistent with the city's plan for growth. The city was providing water service to it. It had difficulty sewering it, but there will be a central sewer system. I think similar to what you see at Hidden Springs or other large developments. The developer is dedicating a segment of what will be the city's Stoddard pathway along the canal. It's a pretty large development on pretty bad ag land. It was only been pasture. It has a lot of surface rock. It's going to be very expensive to develop and put in the infrastructure, but they did get a density that they wanted, even though it was still the most dense we can go is down to a 12,000 square foot lot. They kept some larger lots. Nobody came to testify against it. It was done. We worked extensively with the city of Nampa so that when they are contiguous, they will be required to annex. So here was growth exactly where the city and the county wanted it to happen. And it was pretty smooth sailing. There was a lot of obviously work that goes into it before the hearing, but there was nobody testified against it at the county commission. So Elaine, it wasn't like a Boise City Council meeting for what would be there. So then in the afternoon was a second hearing on a comp plan change and rezone, conditional rezone at the board. They had started the hearings back in January. This was a project that was on a 40-acre farmland right on the Sunny Slope, just north of the Orchard House, if you're familiar with that. And it's some really old subdivisions, I think 70s vintage, that are there now. Pretty low land values, improving a little bit, but kind of a little rough area, so to speak. So the farmer had to sell his land for personal family reason, got purchased by another farmer, and it was sold as a 26-acre development, residential and commercial out on the front of State Highway 55, that beautiful vista when you come around the curve at Hoskins and you look down and it's just gorgeous. They wanted to put commercial. There is the Orchard House and a small gas station that have been there quite a long time. No site plan, no specificity of what this commercial was going to be. The residential was sold. It's going to be affordable farm worker housing, but absolutely no plan or commitment to actually make that happen. And so the staff recommended denial, the P&Z recommended denial, and yet in January at the commission, initial direction was that it was a 2-to-1 vote to approve it. But they wanted to have a development agreement. So with that, The prosecutor had them do another round of hearings. There was one in June, and it was continued until yesterday because at the very last minute, the LDS Church, which runs an orchard along the northern part of the northern boundary of this development and then more extensively to the west, found out about it, because, we send our notices, they go somewhere to Salt Lake City. They hired Heath Clark to represent them, their interests. And in June, they really put in some really strong testimony on how this would negatively affect their operation of the orchard. They were given time to try to work out differences. They could not. It was a little roller coaster at the hearing yesterday afternoon. But it came with, and they had a petition signed by the local people around that area of the Sunny Slope. They had excellent testimony from the orchard managers and the entomologists. Elaine, you don't really get entomologists, I know, testifying at Boise City, but it was fascinating.
Yeah, I'm an entomologist.
And it ended up, and the developer's representative was well known to the commission, the long-standing relationship. He had done work for the county. So there's that. Nice people don't want to say no to their friends or, people they've known a long time. So they were really struggling with all of it, but it came out, it was a 3-0 denial of the whole thing. So they'll do the written decision next week. I've talked to Rachel Spacek today at the Press Tribune because I think stories like that need to get out to help other elected officials that it's okay to deny it. But then the best part, I debriefed with Heath Clark this morning because during the hearing, they also had testimony from the LDS lawyer in Salt Lake. And if you don't know, the Mormon, and I joke with them, I say I'm just the old Catholic girl here. I don't know much about the Mormon Church, but they do have an amazing program, or what they call Farmland Reserve Inc. So Heath is going to see if we can get a good contact of, I want to understand more about that because they have purchased hundreds of, it doesn't include the orchard. That's actually in the name of the actual church, but they have this Farmland Reserve Inc. that owns hundreds of other acres in Canyon County. And so I think if we can get a better understanding of their program, their investments, what future investments they want to make to purchase farmland, that they need to be part of our kind of ag coalition in Canyon County because they probably have tremendous resources to bring to the table. So anyway, I just wanted to share that late breaking story from yesterday. It was pretty amazing just to see the real struggle that the two members of the commission had to really kind of what really changed their mind. And part of it was even the church members saying how supportive of ag our plan is, and they really need to respect that. And so hearing and seeing petitions supportive of agriculture really made, swayed their minds there. Even Heath said he was, until the very end, certain that they were going to approve it. And then it ended up being a 3-0 denial. So anyway, I just wanted to share that. So look at the story. Rachel, it'll probably be a couple weeks before we see it. She'll probably write it after they do the written decision in about 10 to 12 days. But there is hope, there is hope.
Yep.
Tricia, I appreciate you sharing that story. For anyone on the call that's not familiar with you, can you just give a brief introduction of who you are and what you do?
I'm a very old planner. You saw in the chat box, I used to work at Chester County when I was young, back in the late 80s when I moved. I started working there in 1988, just a year before the vote on the bond. I pretty new planner, and county commissioner walked in and said, Tricia, we're going to do a $50 million bond issue. So that was the beginning of my immersion into open space and farmland preservation. But today I've been at Canyon County for about 7 years as the Director of Development Services. So Kate's on the call. She is our long-range planner, or Planner 3, and she has been, laboring sounds like a bad thing, but really working, pulling together our different groups around Canyon County, and we're putting together the draft comp plan. But just like when I was at Boise, the world has changed since we had our initial public involvement. And so there's still some data that we need to understand. I know with the unemployment data in Canyon County, in 1 month, we had 10,000 people added to the unemployment rolls. So Kate's done an initial review of our policies, and they actually, most of the policies really speak to resilience, supporting our small towns and cities, you know, protecting farmland. And I think it shows that good planning can really create resilient communities who can weather that. But we know that we don't really understand what the whole economic picture is. And, you know, so we can't be blind to even the fiscal issues that are small towns. They have, if they had money for planning, they have less money right now to really get their codes in line and do that. So we're still hopeful, but we've had to kind of take a pause to really understand what's going on in the county. It's just everything is too new and too significant that we just can't blithely go forward with the draft that we had. So that's who I am, and that's what we're working on.
Awesome. Thank you, Tricia. So I want to be really respectful of everyone's time. I know we're pushing up on the 7:30 mark now, which is when we're due to wrap up. So first, I just want to give a hearty thank you to everyone that presented this evening. That was great information.